The morning I was sold began the way every winter morning in my uncle's cabin began. Cold. The kind of cold that settled into the rafters and crept down through the loft boards like something alive, something hungry. I woke before the sun rose, the way I had woken every day for 4 winters, because the fire in the stove below had long gone out, and my breath made small white clouds above the straw tick I slept on. I was 19 years old. I had a name my mother gave me, Matilda Renfrew, though she had always called me Tilly in her soft voice. And I held that name close in those dark hours, the way another girl might hold a locket. My hair was the color of wheat at the end of summer. My hands were rough from 4 years of splitting wood and scrubbing pans and hauling water from the creek that ran behind the cabin. And my eyes, I was told, were the pale gray of winter sky. I did not think of myself as pretty. I did not think of myself as much of anything at all in those years. A body that worked, a mouth that stayed shut. That morning, the morning of December the 14th, 1887, I heard voices below me in the cabin before I had even lifted my head from the tick. My Uncle Gideon's voice, thick the way it always was when he had been drinking the night through and was only now winding down toward sleep. And another man's voice, a stranger's, low and careful, the way a man talks when he is buying something and does not wish to seem too eager. I lay very still. I had learned stillness the way other people learn to read. 4 years under Gideon Renfrew's roof had taught me that sound carries and that a careless creak of the loft boards could draw his attention, and his attention, when it fell on me, never fell gently. So I lay on my side with my cheek against the ticking, and I listened. "She's worth at least 40, Gideon said. "You look at her, you'll see, strong, 19 years old, healthy as a milk cow. Her teeth are all in her head, and her back is straight, and she can cook a meal out of flour and water if that's all you've got." The stranger grunted. I did not catch his words, only the shape of them, the cadence of a man doing arithmetic in his head. 40 at the low, my uncle said again. "You wait till the Pine Cache Fair this afternoon, you'll see the others. They got a German girl coming in from Cheyenne, and they got the widow Pritchard's cousin, but my Tilly, she's the youngest of the lot, youngest and strongest. A man could work her 20 years before she broke down." I had heard the word fair before. I had heard in whispers at the general store, in stolen words over Mrs. Hornecker's counter of the Winter Bride auction the town of Pine Cache held each December, a thing left over from the rougher days, a thing the decent people of the territory pretended not to know about. Men with more land than women rode in from 3 counties to look over the girls on the crate stage at the livery-barn, and the girls, most of them orphaned or widowed or simply sold, stood with their heads bowed and their hands folded and let themselves be called out by the auctioneer as though they were horses. I understood, lying there in the loft, what my uncle meant to do with me. I understood it all at once, and I did not cry because I had stopped crying a long time before. But something inside my chest went very still and very cold, colder than the air, colder than the frost on the small window by my head. I thought of my mother. I thought of the way she used to hum while she kneaded bread, a tune with no name that was only hers. I thought of my father, a quiet man who had taught me the names of trees and the shapes of clouds, and who had died 2 days after she did, in the influenza year of 1883, when I was 15, and the world emptied out all at once. I had been shipped to my uncle's door like a parcel, with a tag around my neck and a small carpet bag holding everything I still owned, and Gideon had taken one look at me and said, "Well, girl, you'll earn your keep." And I had. God help me, I had. The stranger left before the sun was fully up. I heard the door close behind him, and I heard my uncle thump down into his chair by the stove and begin to snore almost at once. Then I rose. I climbed down the loft ladder slowly, one rung at a time, and I went out into the pale light of the December morning, with my shawl pulled tight around my shoulders and my breath clouding in front of my face. And I stood by the creek, and I thought about running. There was no place to run to. That was the truth of it, and I made myself look at it the way my father had taught me to look at a problem. Cheyenne was 80 miles south, and the passes were full of snow. The railroad was 40 miles east of Pine Cache, and I had no money for a ticket and no kin alive to meet me at the other end. I had one friend in the world, Mrs. Idella Hornecker, the widow who ran the general store, and Mrs. Idella was 55 years old and not a wealthy woman, and could not hide a grown girl in her back room without the whole town knowing by supper time. So I went back inside. I built up the fire. I made my uncle his breakfast of fried salt pork and cornmeal mush, and I stood by the stove and watched him eat with his grease-slick fingers and his red-rimmed eyes. And I thought, I will stand on that crate this afternoon because I must. I will stand on it, and I will not weep. I will keep what is left of me inside my own skin, and whatever man buys me, whatever man takes me up the trail in his wagon, he will find that he has bought a body and not a soul. The soul belongs to me. The soul my mother gave me belongs to me still. My Uncle Gideon did not speak to me about the fair. He did not warn me or prepare me or offer me the small mercy of the truth. He only said, when he had finished his plate, "Put on the blue dress, the one your mother left you. I want you looking your best today. We are going to town." I went up the loft ladder, and I took down the blue dress from the nail where it had hung for 4 years, wrapped in brown paper to keep the moths from it. It had been my mother's Sunday dress, and she had been a small woman, and the dress fit me closely at the waist and fell to just above my ankles. I put it on in the cold of the loft, my fingers numb on the buttons, and I combed my hair with a wooden comb, and I plaited it in a single long braid down my back. I looked at myself in the little cracked mirror that had also been my mother's, and I saw a young woman with a straight back and a closed mouth and eyes the color of winter sky. And I thought, well, Tilly, here you are. Here is the morning of the fair. How I came to be there, on that crate, in my mother's blue dress, was a story that had no villains in it at first, only small griefs that added themselves together until they became a large grief, the way small snowfalls add themselves together until they become a drift that can bury a sheep. My father and mother had kept a small farm in the Platte Valley, south of Fort Laramie, and we had been poor, but we had been ours. My father was a Scotsman who had come west after the war, and my mother was the daughter of a Kentucky schoolmistress, and between them they had taught me to read the King James Bible, and to add sums in a ledger, and to name the birds that came through the willows in the spring. I remember a life with laughter in it. I remember my mother singing while she stirred a pot of bean soup. I remember my father lifting me to his shoulders so I could see over the tall prairie grass. Then the influenza came through in the fall of '83, and within a week my mother was gone, and within 3 days of her burying, my father had followed her, and I was left in a house that still smelled of her bread and his pipe tobacco, and the neighbors came, and they were kind, but they had their own mouths to feed and their own fevers to bury, and so they wrote a letter to my father's only living brother, a man named Gideon Renfrew, who had come west 10 years before and settled on 160 acres in the Wyoming Territory. And they put me on the stagecoach with a small trunk and a tag around my neck that said, Matilda Renfrew, 15, to be delivered. I remember the ride north. I remember the way the country flattened and then rose, the way the sky grew larger and the trees grew fewer and the wind never stopped. I remember thinking at every way station that perhaps Gideon would be a good man. Perhaps he would have a wife and small children. Perhaps he would take me in and call me daughter, and the grief in my chest would ease by a little. He was at the station when the coach pulled in. A tall man, stooped at the shoulders, his beard streaked with gray, and something dark I could not at first name, which I later understood to be the stain of chewing tobacco. He looked me over the way a man looks over a yearling at a stock sale. He said, "You'll do, get in the wagon." And that was the whole of our first meeting. There was no wife. There had been one, once, a woman named Ruth, but she had left him 3 years before I came, run off with a freighter from Denver, and I did not blame her, though I did not say so. There were no children. There was only Gideon and his bottle and his 160 acres of hard-scrabbled timber and the small, cold cabin at the end of a track so bad that it washed out 3 times a year. And there was me, 15 years old, a pair of hands. I learned in the first week what my life would be. I was to rise before him and build the fire and cook his breakfast and wash his clothes and mend his shirts and haul the water and split the kindling and feed the chickens we kept behind the cabin and card the wool from the 2 ewes he ran on the south meadow. I was to eat what he left on his plate. I was to sleep in the loft where it was cold in winter and hot in summer, and where the rain came through the shakes when the wind was from the north. I was not to speak unless I was spoken to. I was not to leave the place without his permission. I was not to walk into town alone, nor to write letters, nor to keep what few coins came into my hands from the occasional eggs I sold at Mrs. Idella's store. He did not beat me. I will say that for him, because I want to be truthful about what he was and what he was not. He did not raise his hand to me, not once in 4 years, though he raised his voice often, and he had a way of looking at me when he was drunk that made me lock the loft door at night with a piece of baling wire and a prayer. What he did to me was smaller and slower. He stole the years. He stole the small, ordinary joys that a girl of 15 and 16 and 17 ought to have, the dances she ought to attend, and the friends she ought to make, and the letters she ought to receive. He stole them, one day at a time, and he did not notice that he was stealing them, because to him I was not a girl at all. I was a tool. The debts began in the 2nd year. I do not know when exactly he lost the first $1 at the card table in the back of Lyle Spore's saloon in Pine Cache, but I know that by the time I was 17, he was riding into town every Friday night and coming home every Saturday morning with less in his pockets than he had left with, and sometimes with none at all. The acres shrank. He sold off the south meadow with the 2 ewes on it, and then he sold off the timber rights to 40 acres of good pine. And then he sold off the wagon and bought a worse one, and by the autumn of 1887, he was sitting by the stove every night staring into the fire and muttering numbers under his breath. Numbers that meant nothing to me, but that seemed to mean something terrible to him. I knew, in some part of me, that it would come to this. I did not know it would come to the winter fair. I had imagined other endings. I had imagined that he would marry me off to some shopkeeper in town to settle an account, or that he would put me out when I turned 20 and tell me to find my own way. I had not imagined the crate. I had not imagined the livery barn and the auctioneer and the bids beginning at $12. But that was the country I was in, and those were the times. And a girl without parents and without money and without the protection of a decent man was a kind of currency in the Wyoming Territory in the winter of 1887, and my uncle had decided to spend me. The sleigh ride into Pine Cache took the better part of 2 hours. The snow lay heavy on the pines, and the world was very quiet, and I rode beside my uncle on the bench with my hands folded in my lap and my shawl wrapped around my shoulders, and I did not speak, and he did not speak, and the only sound was the creak of the runners and the soft plodding of the old mare's hooves in the packed track. When we came into town, I saw at once that something unusual was happening. The main street of Pine Cache was busier than I had ever seen it on a December afternoon. Wagons lined the hitching rails too deep. Men stood in small knots on the boardwalks, smoking and talking low. I saw ranchers I recognized from Sunday meeting, and I saw men I did not recognize at all. Men with the hard, weathered look of the high country. Men in buffalo coats and wolf fur hats. Men with the snow of the mountain passes still on their boots. My uncle pulled the sleigh up behind the livery barn, and he helped me down with a hand under my elbow, the first time he had touched me in memory, and the touch of his hand made my skin crawl beneath my mother's blue dress. He led me around the side of the barn to the small side door, and he knocked twice, and a man I did not know opened the door and looked me up and down and nodded and said, "Bring her inside, Renfrew. She's number 4. Inside the barn, the air was warmer than outside, thick with the smell of horses and hay and unwashed wool. They had cleared the center of the barn and built up a low platform from packing crates, and on the platform stood 3 young women already, their heads bowed, their hands folded in front of them, like the hands of penitents at a confession. One was perhaps 16, a slight girl with black hair in 2 plaits. One was older, perhaps 25, a woman with a scar on her cheek and eyes that looked at nothing. One was the German girl my uncle had spoken of, fair as a china doll, weeping quietly into a handkerchief. They put me fourth in the line. The auctioneer was a red-faced man in a checked coat, and he had a gavel in his hand and a sheet of paper on a board, and he called out the particulars of each girl as she stood upon the crate. Age, health, whether she could cook, whether she could sew, whether she had any living kin who might object. He called these things out the way a stock auctioneer calls out the weight and the bloodline of a calf. The 16-year-old went first. She sold for $32 to a farmer from Goshen County. The German girl went second. She sold for $55 to a miller from Medicine Bow. A man with a clean white beard who looked at her kindly, and I prayed, standing there in the line, that he would be as kind as he looked. The woman with the scar went third. She sold for $28 to a homesteader whose name I did not catch, and as she stepped down from the crate, she did not look up, not once, not at anyone. Then the auctioneer called my name. "Matilda Renfrew," he said, 19 years old, orphan, raised 4 years by her uncle here, Gideon Renfrew, a respected member of our community. Strong girl, good hands, good health, good teeth, reads and writes and figures, can cook, can sew, can keep a house. Bidding begins at $12. I stepped up onto the crate. I remember the feel of the rough wood through the thin soles of my boots. I remember the smell of the horses in the stalls behind me. I remember keeping my eyes on a knothole in the far wall, a dark, round place in the wood just below the hayloft, and staring at it so hard that my eyes watered, because if I looked at any of the faces in that barn, I knew I would break, and I had promised myself in the creek bed that morning that I would not break. $12, said a voice to my left. 15, said another. 20, said a third. The bids came quick at first, the way bids do when a thing is fresh on the block, and I felt each one in my chest like a small stone being laid on top of me. 20, 25, 30, 32. A man in the front row, a big man with a red face and a curling black beard and a coat of wolf fur, leaned forward on his cane and said, in a voice that carried, $40. 40, said the auctioneer. $40 to Mr. Haldor Mattson of the Bitter Creek Ranch. Do I hear 45? The barn went quiet. I could feel, without looking, that the other men were turning their faces away. Haldor Mattson, I learned later, was a rancher with a reputation, a man who had buried 2 wives in 10 years, and a man whose cowhands did not stay on past the first winter. And the fact that he had bid $40 for me meant that most of the other bidders in that barn had decided to sit back and let him have me. 40, said the auctioneer, going once, going twice. My uncle, at the side of the crate, was grinning. I could see him out of the corner of my eye. He was grinning the way a man grins when he has played a bad hand and the cards have come right for him anyway. And then, from the back of the barn, from behind the hanging lantern and the packed bodies of the standing men, a voice spoke. It spoke only one word, and it spoke it quietly, but the barn was quiet enough by then that the word carried to every corner. 80, the voice said. The silence that followed was the deepest silence I had ever heard inside a building with 100 men in it. Every head turned. Every face swung toward the back of the barn. I turned too, and I saw, for the first time, the man who would change my life. He was standing just inside the open double doors at the rear of the barn, with the gray light of the December afternoon behind him, and a fall of fresh snow visible beyond his shoulders. He was tall, taller than most of the men around him, and broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had swung an axe every day of his adult life. He wore a long wool coat the color of bark, and a felt hat pulled low over his eyes, and his boots were wet to the ankle with snow, and his face was clean-shaven in the manner of the old trappers, though his hair, what I could see of it beneath the hat, was dark and thick and touched at the temples with the first gray of a man in his middle 30s. He did not smile. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at me, and his eyes were the color of river water running under ice, pale and clear and very steady, and he said nothing more. He had said his 80, and he was waiting. Haldor Mattson turned slowly on his cane. His red face grew redder. He looked the stranger up and down, and he sneered, and he said, in a voice loud enough for the whole barn to hear, "You bidding, mountain man?" The tall man did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He only said, evenly and without heat, "I am." $50, said Mattson, and he said it the way a man says a thing when he is testing whether the other man knows the game. 100, said the mountain man. The barn made a sound then, a small collective breath, the sound a crowd makes when it realizes it is watching something it had not expected to watch. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. My Uncle Gideon's face did something I had not seen it do in 4 years. His eyes lit up, not with kindness, not with pride, with the bright, greedy gleam of a man who is counting coins in his head and finding that the pile is larger than he had dared to hope. Haldor Mattson looked at the mountain man for a long moment. Then he spat on the sawdust floor and he said, "Keep her, trapper. She's not worth 100. And he turned away and he pushed through the crowd toward the front doors, and the crowd parted for him and then closed behind him. And he was gone. $100, said the auctioneer, and his voice was a little uncertain now, because $100 was more than any bride had sold for at the Pine Cache Winter Fair in 10 years, and he did not quite know what to do with it. Going once, going twice. The gavel fell. The sound of it was small in the great space of the barn. "Sold," said the auctioneer, to the gentleman in the back, for $100. I do not remember stepping down from the crate. I remember only that my legs were shaking and that the knothole in the far wall blurred and came clear again, and that my uncle was at my elbow pulling me forward, and that the crowd was parting, and that the mountain man was walking toward me through the sawdust with a small leather purse in his hand. He did not look at my uncle. He walked past my uncle as though my uncle were not there. He stopped in front of the table where the auctioneer stood, and he opened the purse, and he counted out $100 in gold coin onto the table, slowly, 1 coin at a time, and the coins made a small, bright sound against the wood that I can still hear if I close my eyes. He did not count them twice. He counted them once, and he was right the first time. Then he turned to me. He took off his felt hat. I noticed his hair then, dark and a little curling at the ends where it had been pressed down by the brim. He held the hat in both hands, the way a man holds a hat in a church, and he looked at me with those river ice eyes, and he spoke so quietly that I had to lean toward him to hear. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Eben Kincaid-Strickland. I have a cabin on Silver Ridge, 2 days' drive north and east of here, and I have a daughter who is 8 years old and who needs a mother. I will drive you there today if you will come. If you choose to stay, you stay on your own terms, and I will ask nothing of you that you do not freely give. If you choose to leave at any time, I will drive you to the train station at Rock Springs, and I will pay your passage to anywhere in this country you wish to go. Nothing is owed. The money I paid, that was for your uncle, not for you. You are not a thing that can be bought." He said this in one even breath, without pausing, as though he had practiced the words on the ride down the mountain, as though he had thought very carefully about what he would say when this moment came. When he had finished, he put his hat back on, and he waited. I could not speak at first. My throat had closed, and my tongue was thick, and the tears I had promised myself I would not shed were standing in my eyes. I looked up at him, this stranger who had paid $100 gold for me, and who was telling me, in the same breath, that I did not belong to him, and I saw in his face something I had not seen in any man's face in 4 years. I saw gravity. I saw a man who meant exactly what he said, and no more, and no less. I nodded. I could not do anything else. I nodded, and I said, in a voice that was smaller than I wanted it to be, "Yes, sir, I will come." He held out his arm for me, the way a gentleman holds out his arm to a lady at a door, and I took it. My hand barely reached the crook of his elbow, through the heavy wool of his coat. We walked out of the barn together, and my Uncle Gideon called after us, and the mountain man did not turn, and did not answer, and we walked out through the snow to his wagon, and he helped me up onto the seat, and he spread a heavy wool blanket across my lap, and he climbed up beside me and took the reins, and we drove out of Pine Cache with the snow falling around us in slow, soft flakes, and I did not look back, not once. The road up to Silver Ridge climbed slowly at first, winding through the pine and aspen country north of town, and then more steeply, the grade pulling at the two bay horses until their breath came in white clouds and their harness creaked with the effort. The snow fell without stopping. It fell in great slow flakes that settled on the brim of Eben's hat and on the wool blanket across my lap and on the backs of the horses, and the world shrank down to the sound of the runners on the packed track and the jingle of the harness bells and the soft, steady crunch of the hooves in the fresh powder. We did not speak for the first hour. I sat beside him on the bench with my hands folded beneath the blanket and my eyes on the road ahead, and I felt the warmth of him next to me, the simple animal warmth of a body, and I was grateful for it without knowing how to say so. He did not look at me. He looked at the road and at the horses and at the sky. Once a hare crossed the track in front of us, its coat already white for winter, and he clucked softly to the horses to slow them, and then clucked again to move them on. After the first hour, he spoke. He did not turn his head. He only said, quietly, "Her name is Maddie June. The girl, my daughter. She was born in the spring of '79, and her mother died of the fever in the winter of '81. She does not remember her mother. She has been raised by me and by Mrs. Hornecker, who comes up twice a month, and by Washakie Daybreak, who is a neighbor of mine from the Wind River people. She is a quiet child. She will be shy with you. Do not take it for coldness." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You do not need to call me sir. My name is Eben." I said, "Yes, Mr. Kincaid-Strickland." He said, nothing more after that for a time. I saw the corner of his mouth move, not a smile, exactly, but the shape of one, the shadow of one. And then he shook the reins gently, and the horses pulled us on up the grade. We stopped once, at a way station kept by an old Norwegian couple at the foot of the ridge proper, and Eben helped me down from the wagon and walked me inside and bought me a bowl of barley soup and a tin cup of hot coffee, and he sat across the rough pine table from me and watched me eat. And when I had finished, he said, "There is more." And I shook my head, and he nodded, and he paid the old woman, and he helped me back up onto the wagon. He gave me his own blanket then, the heavy Hudson's Bay with the red stripes that he had been keeping across his own knees, and he took a thinner one from the box behind the seat for himself, and when I tried to refuse, he said only, "Miss Renfrew, the cold out of these passes after sundown is not a thing I will see you sit in. Please." And so I took it, and I wrapped it around my shoulders, and it smelled of pine smoke and of the good clean oil of a man who worked with his hands and washed at the end of the day. He did not touch my hand. I want to say that plainly. For all the hours of that drive, in the close quarters of that wagon bench with a wool blanket between us and $100 worth of transaction behind us, he did not touch my hand. He did not touch my shoulder. He did not brush my sleeve. He left the space between us whole. And in that whole and untouched space, I felt something I had not felt in 4 years and could barely recognize. I felt safe. The light went out of the sky slowly, the way it does in the mountain country, the blue turning to gray and the gray turning to a deep purple rose along the western ridges, and the first stars came out in the east, and still the snow fell, and still we climbed. We had left Pine Cache a little after 2 in the afternoon, and it was full dark by the time we came up onto the last bench of the ridge, and the trees fell back on either side, and I saw, ahead of us, in the lantern light, the shape of a cabin. It was a 3-room log cabin, low and long and solid, with a stone chimney at the north end from which a thin, steady ribbon of smoke rose straight up into the windless air. A lantern was burning in the front window. The roof was deep with snow, and the snow on the roof was marked with the soft tracks of a small animal, perhaps a cat or a pine marten. A small barn stood 30 yards off, and beyond the barn a smaller outbuilding, and beyond that the black wall of the pines going on up the ridge to the unseen peaks. In the doorway of the cabin, holding the door half open against the cold, stood a small girl in a blue calico dress. She had her father's dark hair and her father's eyes, the same pale color, though hers were wider and rounder and full of a cautious light. She was small for 8, thin the way children in the high country are thin, and she stood very straight in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her, and she watched us come without moving. Eben drew the wagon up to the door and climbed down and came around to my side and held up his hand, and I took it for the first time to climb down, and the touch of his hand through my mitten was firm and brief and gone as soon as my feet found the snow. He led me up the 2 wooden steps to the porch. "Maddie June," he said, "this is Miss Matilda Renfrew. She has come up from Pine Cache with me. She will be staying with us for a little while. You will call her Miss Renfrew until she tells you what else to call her." Maddie June looked up at me. She looked a long time, the way children look when they are deciding whether a thing is safe. Then she said, in a voice as clear and small as a piece of new glass, "You're the new bride." I knelt down in the snow of the porch. I knelt so that my eyes were level with hers, and I took both of her small hands in mine, and I said, as gently as I knew how, "No, sweet girl, I am not. I am a visitor. I came up the mountain to meet you, and I am going to stay for a few days, and we are going to find out if we like each other. That is all for now." She considered this. She was a child who considered things. I saw her father in that consideration. She turned my hands over, one at a time, and she looked at my palms, and she ran the pad of her small thumb across the calluses at the base of my fingers, and then she nodded once, and she said, "All right, you can come in then. I have soup on." And that was how I met Maddie June Kincaid on the first evening of the rest of my life. The cabin was warmer than any room I had been in 4 years. There was a cast iron stove against the north wall and a fire burning well in it, and the main room was laid out simply, with a long pine table and 4 cane-bottom chairs and a braided rag rug in the center of the floor, and a shelf of books along the east wall. Books. I had not seen so many books in one place since the Platte Valley schoolhouse of my childhood. I counted them without meaning to. 42 volumes, dark cloth bindings, some older and worn, some newer and stiff. There were 2 small rooms opening off the main room, one on either side. One was Eben's, with a narrow iron bed and a trunk and a washstand. The other was Maddie June's, with a smaller bed and a little shelf of carved wooden animals and a sampler on the wall that read, "Bless this house in uneven cross-stitch." Maddie June had made a soup of venison and barley and wild onion, and she served it to us in 3 tin bowls on the pine table, and we ate in a quiet that was not uncomfortable, a quiet that seemed to be the natural state of that house. When we had finished, Eben took the bowls to the wash basin and washed them himself, and he dried them, and he put them on the shelf, and he said, "Miss Renfrew, you will sleep tonight in my room. I have clean sheets on the bed. Mattie June will sleep where she always sleeps. I will sleep in the small cabin out back where I keep the traps. There is a stove there, and I will be warm enough. In the morning we will see what is to be done." I said, "Mr. Kincaid-Strickland, I cannot take your bed." He said, "You can and you will. I will not hear otherwise. Good night, Miss Renfrew." And he lifted his hat from the peg by the door, and he went out into the snow, and the door closed behind him, and I stood in the warm kitchen with the small girl looking up at me, and I did not know what to do with my hands. Mattie June, it turned out, knew what to do. She took my hand in hers, quite without ceremony, and she led me into her father's small bedroom, and she showed me where the washstand was, and where the lamp was, and where the extra blanket was folded at the foot of the bed, and she said, "Good night, Miss Renfrew," and she went out and closed the door softly behind her. I sat on the edge of Eben Kincaid-Strickland's bed in his cabin on Silver Ridge, in the blue dress that had been my mother's, with $100 of his gold counted out on an auctioneer's table behind me, and the whole of my 19 years in ruins at my feet, and I pressed my face into the feather pillow on his bed, and I wept. I wept silently, the way I had learned to weep in my uncle's loft, without sound, because even now some old fear in me said that a man with a rifle in the next cabin over might hear and come. And I knew, even as I thought it, that he would not. I knew it the way one knows the sun will rise. He would not come because he had said he would not come. And in my 19 years, I had not met many men whose word matched their deed. But I had met one tonight, and I pressed my face into his pillow, and I wept for the 4 years I had lost, and for the gentleness I had forgotten existed in the world. I slept after a time. I slept deeply, the way a body sleeps when it has finally been allowed to lay down its burden, and I did not dream, and when I woke it was morning, and there was the smell of coffee and of pine wood smoke coming under the door, and I could hear, very faintly, the voice of a small girl reading aloud to her father from the Gospel of Luke. That first day became a week, and the week became a month, and the month became the slow unfolding of a season. I learned the rhythms of that cabin the way I had once learned my mother's kitchen, by watching and by helping, and by being corrected gently when I made a mistake. Eben rose before dawn. He ran a trap line that ran 3 miles east along the ridge, and then looped back along the creek, and he was gone with the first gray light, and came back by mid-morning with whatever the line had given him. Marten and mink most often, a beaver now and then, a fox if the weather had been cold. He skinned what needed skinning in the small outbuilding where he slept, and he stretched the hides on frames against the wall, and he came in for coffee at 10 o'clock, and he taught Mattie June her letters and her sums until noon. After noon, he went out with his axe. He was building, that winter, an addition to the cabin, a 4th room along the south side, though he did not tell me at first what the room was for. He felled trees and limbed them and dragged them in with the horses, and he notched them and laid them one by one, and I would hear the steady ring of his axe from the dooryard while I helped Mattie June with the wash, or with the bread, or with the small tasks of the cabin that fill a winter day. In the evening he read. He read to Mattie June, and after she had fallen asleep in her little bed, he read to himself by the light of the kerosene lamp, and once or twice I came out of the bedroom he had given me and I sat at the table with my mending, and I listened to the soft turn of his pages, and I felt something in my chest that I could not yet name, but that had the shape of peace. He was a private man. I had understood that the first day, and I understood it more deeply as the weeks went on. He was not rough. That is what I want to say about him. The world of the Wyoming Territory in 1887 had many rough men in it, men whose griefs and whose drinks and whose hard years had worn them down into something sharp. And my uncle had been one of those, and Haldor Mattson had been one of those. And I had thought, perhaps, in my first hours on the ridge, that Eben Kincaid-Strickland would turn out to be one of them too, only quieter. He was not. He was simply private. He had lost his wife 6 years before, a young woman named Clara from Virginia, and he had buried her on the south slope above the creek with his own hands, and he had raised his small daughter alone from the age of 2, and in the doing of it, he had become a man who kept his grief and his tenderness and his deep, still humor in close containers inside himself, and who opened those containers only to those he trusted, and only a little at a time. He trusted his daughter. He trusted Mrs. Idella Hornecker, who came up the track in her old spring wagon every 2 weeks with cornbread and milk and news of the town. He trusted Washakie Daybreak, the Shoshone man who lived 3 miles west along the ridge, a man of 45 with long black hair going to iron gray at the temples and a face lined like the bark of an old juniper. Washakie came over on horseback one morning in late January with the hide of a winter-killed mule deer rolled behind his saddle and a basket of cornmeal that his wife had ground at their mill, and he came into the cabin and he sat at the pine table and he drank coffee with Eben, and they spoke sometimes in English and sometimes in a mixture of Shoshone and trade Spanish that I could not follow, and he greeted me gravely the way a man greets a woman he is prepared to respect, and he did not stare at me, and he did not ask me questions about how I had come to be there. He said only to Eben, "You have done a decent thing, I think." And Eben said, "I hope so," and Washakie nodded and said no more. Mrs. Idella came up on the first Tuesday in January with a wagon full of supplies and a face full of questions she did not ask. She was a short, round woman with white hair under a black bonnet and the sharpest blue eyes I had ever seen, and she had been my one friend in Pine Cache through the 4 years of my uncle's guardianship. And when she saw me at the door of the Silver Ridge cabin with a clean apron over my mother's blue dress and a small flush of color in my cheeks, she stopped on the porch with her basket of cornbread in her hands, and she said, "Well, Matilda Renfrew, I will be," and her eyes filled up with tears, and she set down the basket, and she took me in her arms and held me for a long moment without speaking. She stayed the afternoon. She and Mattie June and I sat at the table, and Mrs. Idella told us the news of Pine Cache, the way the Reverend had preached 2 Sundays ago on the Book of Ruth, the way old Mrs. Spoor had passed in her sleep, the way Haldor Mattson had ridden out of town 3 days after the fair and no one had seen him since, the way my Uncle Gideon had been seen at the saloon looking both richer and drunker than usual. And she told me, when Mattie June had gone out to feed the chickens, that the whole town was talking about what had happened at the winter fair, that the mountain man who had paid $100 had become something of a legend already, and that the decent women of Pine Cache, the women who had pretended for years not to know about the auction, were saying among themselves that perhaps it had not been so bad a thing after all. I said to her, "Mrs. Idella, what do you think of him?" She looked at me with those blue eyes for a long time. Then she said, "Tilly, I have known Eben Kincaid-Strickland for 9 years. I knew him when Clara was alive, and I knew him the day he buried her, and I have known him every month since, when he has come down into my store for his sugar and his salt and his cartridges and his quinine. In 9 years, I have never known him to say a word he did not mean, or to do a thing he was ashamed of. He is a private man, and he is a grieving man, and he is a tender man, and the last of those is not easy to see at first, but it is there. You are safe on this ridge, Tilly, as safe as a woman can be in this country, maybe safer. I nodded. I did not trust myself to speak. She said, "And I will tell you one more thing, and then I will hold my peace. I will tell you that he has not asked a woman for anything since Clara. Not in 6 years. I have watched 3 good women of this town, and 2 of the outlying settlements try their hand at drawing him out, and he has been polite with all of them, and courted with none of them. And I have believed until very lately that he would live the rest of his days a widower. I do not believe it anymore. You will do what you will do, Tilly, and I will say no more. Only that." She left that afternoon. She hugged me again at the door, and she pressed a small paper sack of penny sweets into Maddie June's hand, and she climbed into her wagon, and she drove away down the track in the bright, cold January light. And I stood on the porch and watched her go with a feeling in my chest that I had not felt in a long time, a feeling that I was, perhaps, still known, that I had not vanished altogether in the 4 years of my uncle's cabin, that someone in the world, at least one someone, remembered my mother's voice and my father's name and the girl I had been before. That evening I made cornbread of my own, using Mrs. Adela's cornmeal and the good fresh milk she had brought, and I set it on the pine table beside the venison stew Maddie June had helped me with. And Eben came in from the woodshed with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his hair damp from the wash basin, and he stopped in the doorway and he looked at the table for a long moment, and then he looked at me and he said, "Miss Renfrew, that is a very fine thing to come home to." And he sat down and he bowed his head and he said grace, the first time I had heard him say it aloud, and he thanked the Lord for the food and for the warmth of the house and for the hands that had prepared it, and he did not say my name in the grace, but I felt somehow that he had. If you are listening to this story tonight, and you find that the quiet of it suits you, I would be grateful if you stayed with me to the end. There is more to tell, and the weather of the story is about to turn, and I do not like to leave a listener in the cold. Come with me up the ridge a little farther. January passed into February, and February brought the hardest cold of the winter, a dry, still cold that cracked the trees in the night with small reports like distant gunshots. The creek froze solid to the rocks. The chickens stopped laying. Eben brought the 2 milch goats into the lean-to behind the cabin and fed them by hand, and Maddie June and I spent long afternoons by the stove with our sewing and our reading, and I taught her a song my mother had taught me, a little song about a wren in the willow tree, and she sang it in her clear, small voice over and over until she had it by heart and could sing it without me. It was in the 2nd week of February that my uncle came up the ridge. I did not see him coming at first. I was in the kitchen, kneading bread for the next day's loaves, and Maddie June was at the table doing her sums on a slate. Eben was in the woodshed with Washakie Daybreak, who had come over that morning to help with the notching of the new room. The sound that reached me first was the sound of a horse being ridden too hard up the last grade, the labored breathing of an animal that had been pushed beyond what the grade and the snow warranted. Then I heard the voice. "Matilda," the voice called. "Matilda Renfrew, come out here, girl." I knew the voice before I knew it. I knew it with the old animal knowledge of 4 winters under it, and my hands stopped in the dough, and the blood went out of my face, and Mattie June looked up from her slate and saw my face and said, "Who is that, Miss Renfrew?" in a small, frightened voice. "That is my uncle," I said, and I tried to keep my voice even for her sake. "Stay in here, sweet girl. Stay right where you are." I wiped my hands on my apron, and I went to the window, and I looked out, and there was Gideon Renfrew on the back of a lathered bay horse, drawn up in the dooryard with his hat pushed back and his face red with drink and with cold, and he had a bottle in one hand and the reins in the other, and he was swaying in the saddle, and I saw at once that he had ridden the whole way up from Pine Cache drunk, and that he had taken the last grade at a gallop to work up the courage for what he meant to do. Eben had heard him too. Eben came out of the woodshed without haste, and Washakie came with him, and they walked together across the dooryard toward the porch, and Eben had his rifle in the crook of his arm, the way a man carries a rifle when he is going out to look at a fence line, not raised and not aimed, only present. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Mr. Renfrew," Eben said, evenly, "you are a long way from home." My uncle laughed. It was a terrible laugh, high and broken, the laugh of a man who has been drinking since breakfast and has come to believe, in the long ride up the mountain, that he is owed something by the world. "Mountain man," he said, "I have come for what's mine." Eben said nothing. He only looked at him. "You paid $100 for her," my uncle said. $100. That was a fair price for a bride, mountain man. But you didn't marry her, did you? Word come down off this ridge that you didn't marry her. You are keeping her up here as a housekeeper. A housekeeper, mountain man. That's not what I sold you. I sold you a wife, and a wife is worth more than a housekeeper. I reckon you owe me another 50 for the difference." Eben was quiet a long moment. The wind moved in the pines above the cabin. I stood in the doorway with Mattie June's small hand clutched in the back of my apron because she had come up behind me despite what I had said, and I could feel her breathing fast against the small of my back. "Mr. Renfrew," Eben said at last, "I paid you $100 gold on the 14th of December at the livery-barn in Pine Cache. I paid you in front of the auctioneer and in front of 100 witnesses. The money was not for a wife, and it was not for a housekeeper. The money was to free Miss Renfrew from your household, and the money did that, and our business is concluded. She is not yours to sell twice. Ride on, Mr. Renfrew, or be escorted." My uncle's face did a thing I had seen it do 100 times in 4 years. It went from red to purple, and the muscles at his jaw worked, and his eyes narrowed down to 2 small slits, and I knew that in another man at another time those signs would have led to a raised fist, or a raised voice, or a knocked-over chair. But Gideon Renfrew was 50 years old and half drunk on a lathered horse, and Eben Kincaid-Strickland was 36 years old and sober, and standing on his own porch with a rifle in the crook of his arm and a Shoshone friend at his shoulder. And my uncle, whatever else he was not a fool. Not all the way. He saw the arithmetic. He spat on the snow. He pulled the horse's head around with a roughness that made the poor beast flinch. He said, in a voice thick with the bottle, "You'll regret this, mountain man. The girl is not worth it. She is a mouse. She was always a mouse." And he dug his heels into the horse, and the horse staggered, and then broke into a tired trot, and he rode back down the track the way he had come, and the track swallowed him up in the trees. And that was the last I ever saw of my Uncle Gideon Renfrew in this world. Eben stood on the porch a long time after my uncle was gone. He stood with his rifle still in the crook of his arm, and his eyes on the place where the track disappeared into the pines. And he did not move, and he did not speak. Washakie Daybreak stood beside him, and neither did he. Then Eben turned, slowly, and he came up the 2 steps, and he saw me in the doorway with Mattie June behind me, and he took off his hat. "Miss Renfrew," he said, "I am sorry that you had to hear that. I am sorry that you had to hear any of it." I said, "Mr. Kincaid-Strickland, it was not your fault. You did not bring him here." He said, "I know, but I am sorry all the same. He will not come back. I give you my word. If he tries, he will not get past the first bench of the ridge. Washakie and I have an agreement on such things." He put his hat back on, and he went out to tend to the horse. And Mattie June pressed her face into the back of my apron and wept a little. And I stroked her hair, and I told her it was all right. It was all right. The bad man had gone, and he would not come back. And I realized as I said it that I believed it. I believed it because Eben had said it, and Eben did not lie. And I realized also that somewhere in the weeks since I had come up the ridge, I had begun to rest my weight, in small ways, on his word. It was a new thing for me to rest my weight on any man's word. I stood in the doorway of the cabin on Silver Ridge that February afternoon, and I felt the new thing settling into place inside me. And I did not flinch from it, and I did not push it away. The winter broke slowly. It broke the way a long winter breaks in the high country, not all at once, but in small stages. A warm afternoon in the last week of February, when the icicles began to drip from the eaves. A morning in early March, when a chickadee called from the aspens in a note I had not heard since October. A week of sharp, bright days, when the snow on the south-facing slopes softened and began to settle. The creek opened in patches. The goats went out to pasture. Mattie June found the first crocus of the year, a small purple point in the black mud under the porch, and she brought it inside on her palm as though she were carrying a living star. And I put it in a tin cup of water on the windowsill, and we watched it for 3 days until it faded. April came, and with April came the thaw proper, and the ridge ran with water, and the air smelled of wet pine and wet earth and the far faint promise of grass. Eben finished the new room. He had built it slowly and carefully all through the cold months, and on the first warm Saturday of April, he hung the door on its hinges, and he stepped back, and he looked at it, and he said to me, "Miss Renfrew, I built this room for you. I built it with the understanding that you might never use it, and I built it with the understanding that if you did use it, it would be yours and no one else's, and that you would have a door that closed, and a window that opened, and a corner of the house that was your own." I did not know what to say to that. I stood in the dooryard with my hands twisted in my apron, and I looked at the little room, the raw pine of the new logs, the glass in the small window still wet with the morning dew, and I felt a thing rising up in my chest that was new, and that was large, and that did not have a name in any language I spoke. I said, "Mr. Kincaid-Strickland, I do not know how to thank you." He said, "There is nothing to thank me for. A woman should have a door." He said it simply, the way a man says a thing he has thought about for a long time and has decided is true. And he went back to his woodshed, and I stood in the dooryard, and I watched the light move on the new pine, and I felt the shape of my life begin to turn. It was 2 weeks after that, in the middle of April, on a warm, bright afternoon when the creek was running full and the first greenish haze was on the willows along the water, that Eben asked me to stay. I was down at the creek washing Mattie June's calico dress. She had torn the hem on a root the day before, and I had mended it in the morning, and now I was rinsing the clean dress in the cold, quick water of the creek, kneeling on a flat stone with my sleeves rolled to the elbow and the bright sun warm on the back of my neck. I heard his step behind me. I had learned his step by then. I knew it from a mule deer's, and I knew it from Washakee's, and I knew it from any man's, and I did not turn around. He stopped a little way off. He waited until I had finished rinsing the dress and had laid it out flat on the stone beside me. Then he said quietly, "Miss Renfrew, may I speak with you?" I said, "Yes." He took off his hat. He held it in both hands, the way he had held it in the livery barn 4 months ago, and he looked down at the water, and he said, "I have been a widower 6 years. My wife Clara was a good woman, and I loved her well, and I buried her on the slope above this creek, and for 6 years I have not asked a woman for anything. Not her hand, and not her company, and not even her forgiveness when I was curt with her at the general store, because I have not felt I had the right. I have felt that my life was done in that way, and that what was left to me was my daughter, and my ridge, and my trapline, and that this was enough, and more than many men are given." He paused. I did not look up at him. I could not yet. I looked at the water running over the stones, clear and cold, the dark shape of a brook trout holding steady in the current beneath an overhang. He said, "Since you came up this mountain in December, something has changed in me. I did not set out to have it change. I did not pay that $100 hoping it would change. I paid the $100 because I heard at the livery barn 2 days before the fair that a girl from the South Country was going to be put up, and I heard from Mrs. Hornecker that her name was Renfrew and that her uncle was a drunkard, and I came down off this ridge meaning to do a decent thing and to drive home and to forget it. I did not forget it. I have not forgotten it for a day." He drew a breath. I could hear him draw it. He said, "Miss Renfrew, I am asking now. I am asking for the first time in 6 years. Would you stay? Not as a bride I bought. That is done, and it is behind us, and it will never be spoken of again on this ridge, or anywhere I have breath to speak. I am asking you to stay as a woman I would court. From this day forward, I would ask your permission to walk with you in the evenings. I would ask your permission to speak your given name. I would ask your permission in time, if the time came, and if it did not come, I would honor that also, to ask you to be my wife. I am asking slowly, because I know only how to ask slowly. I am asking because I have found that I cannot not ask." The creek ran. A jay called somewhere up the slope. I knelt on the flat stone with the wet calico dress between my hands, and I looked at the water, and I felt the tears running down my face in a way I had not let them run for a long time, not since the first night in his bed with my face in the pillow, and the tears ran warm in the warm April sun, and they were not tears of grief. I said at last, "Mr. Kincaid-Strickland." He said, "Eben, if you would." I said, "Eben, yes, but slowly." He said, "Slowly is the only way I know." He did not touch me. He did not kneel. He did not kiss my hand. He stood there by the creek in the April light with his hat in his 2 hands, and he nodded, and he said, "Thank you, Tilly. And that was the first time he had spoken my given name, and the sound of it in his voice was the sound of a door opening somewhere deep inside my chest. He put his hat back on. He said, "I will walk with you this evening, if you are willing. Up to the south slope, to the place where the arrow-leaf balsam root is beginning to come in. I think you would like to see it." I said, "I would like that very much." He nodded. He turned and he walked back up the slope toward the cabin, and I knelt by the creek with the wet calico dress between my hands, and I watched him go, and I pressed the back of my wrist against my mouth. And I laughed. I laughed quietly, the way a woman laughs when she has come through a long winter and found the spring at the end of it. And the laugh shook me, and the tears ran with it, and the jay called again up the slope, and the brook trout flicked its tail under the overhang and was gone. The courting lasted from April into May, and from May into the first weeks of June. It was a quiet courting and a careful one, and it suited us both. He walked with me in the evenings on the south slope, and along the creek, and up to the bench above the cabin where the view opened out across 50 miles of mountain country. He called me Tilly, and he waited for me to call him Eben, which I did on the second week, and I did not falter on it. He took my hand for the first time on the last day of April, when I stumbled on a loose stone on the path down from the bench, and he caught my elbow, and then my hand. And he held my hand the rest of the way down to the cabin, and neither of us spoke of it. And I did not pull my hand away. Maddie June saw everything. She was a child of 8 who had lived all her life on a mountain with a quiet father, and she noticed small changes the way another child notices loud ones. She said to me one evening in the middle of May, as I was braiding her hair for bed, "Miss Renfrew, are you going to marry Papa?" And I held the brush in my hand, and I looked at her in the small mirror on the wall, and I said, "Sweet girl, I think perhaps I am. Would that be all right with you?" She thought about it. She thought about it for a long moment, the way she thought about everything, and then she nodded, very seriously, and she said, "Yes, I would like that. I would like it if you stayed, Miss Renfrew. I do not remember my mamma, and I know you are not her, and I know you will not try to be her, and that is all right. I would like to have you, if you would like to have me." I put down the brush. I turned her around on the little stool so that she was facing me, and I took her small face in my 2 hands, and I said, "Maddie June Kincaid, I would like very much to have you. I would like it more than I know how to say." She nodded. She said, "All right." And she climbed into her little bed, and I pulled the blanket up to her chin, and I blew out the lamp, and I went out to the main room, and Eben was at the pine table with his Bible open in front of him. And he looked up at me, and I did not need to tell him what had passed in the small bedroom, because he had heard it through the thin log wall, and his face was quiet and full. The wedding was on the second Saturday of June, on a warm, still afternoon with the sky the color of washed cornflower, and the meadow above the cabin in full bloom with balsam root and paintbrush and blue penstemon. Mrs. Idella came up on the Thursday with her spring wagon full of provisions and with a bolt of soft white cotton she had ordered from Denver a month before. And she and I sat at the pine table for 2 days with our needles and our thimbles, and we cut and fitted and sewed a simple dress, gathered at the waist and with a small lace collar she had saved from her own wedding 35 years before in Ohio. And when I put it on in the bedroom on the Saturday morning and looked at myself in the small mirror, I did not recognize the woman who looked back at me and then I did. Reverend Barnabas Finchley rode up the track on a gray mule at about 11 in the morning. He was a circuit preacher of 60, with a long white beard and kind brown eyes, and a small worn Bible in his saddlebag. And he had baptized Mattie June 8 years before, and he had buried Clara 6 years before, and he knew the mountain and the family. And he came up the steps, and he took off his wide-brimmed hat, and he said, "Well, Eben, well, well." And he shook Eben's hand a long time without speaking. And then he turned to me, and he took my hand too, and he said, "Miss Renfrew, the Lord has done a good thing here, a good thing. I am glad to be the one to seal it." Washakie Daybreak came at noon. He came with his wife, a small woman with iron-gray braids and a quiet smile, whose name was Pia, and they brought a basket of wild strawberries they had gathered that morning on the lower slopes. And Pia put her hand on my cheek, just for a moment, and she said something in Shoshone that I did not understand, and Washakie translated. "She says you have brought spring to this house. She says the house has been waiting." We walked up the small rise above the cabin at 1 o'clock. Eben and I, and Mattie June, and Mrs. Idella, and Washakie, and Pia, and the Reverend. The wind moved in the grass. The balsam root stood tall and golden along the path. Eben wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers, and the same wool coat he had worn in the livery barn, though the snow was long gone from the boots now, and I wore the white cotton dress Mrs. Idella and I had sewn, and Mattie June wore her blue calico dress and carried a small braided ring of grass that Pia had made for her, and inside the braided grass was the simple gold band Eben had ridden to Rock Springs to buy in May. The Reverend read from the book of Ruth. He read the old verses, the verses I had heard in the Platte Valley schoolhouse when I was a child, and that I had not heard since. The verses about where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God. He read them slowly and in his good, deep voice, and the wind moved in the grass, and Mattie June held up the small braid of grass with the ring inside it. And Eben took the ring, and he took my hand, and he slid the ring onto my finger, and his hand was steady and warm. And he looked at me with those river ice eyes that were not ice at all, had never been ice, had only ever been still water running deep, and he said his vows. I said mine. I said them in the voice my mother had given me, and I said them looking up into his face, and I did not weep, because the time for weeping was behind me now, behind us both. And when the Reverend pronounced us man and wife, Eben leaned down, and for the first time in all the months I had known him, he kissed me, softly, on the mouth, and I felt the whole of the ridge, and the whole of the sky, and the whole of the 6 years he had waited, and the 4 years I had waited flowing into that one quiet kiss. And then he stepped back, and he took my hand in his, and we walked down off the rise together toward the cabin. And Mattie June ran ahead of us laughing, and Mrs. Idella was crying into her handkerchief, and Washakie and Pia were walking behind us, and the Reverend was singing, very softly, a hymn in his old good voice, and the June sun lay on all of us like a kind of benediction. I have thought often, in the years since, about the difference between being bought and being chosen. I was bought on the 14th of December, 1887, in a livery barn in Pine Cache for $100 gold, and the man who bought me walked across the sawdust and told me in the same breath that I was not a thing that could be bought, and that he had paid only to free me. That was the first grace. I was chosen on the second Saturday of June, 1888, on a rise above a cabin on Silver Ridge, by the same man in a white cotton dress I had sewn with my friend. That was the second grace. And I have come to believe, in the long life that followed, that the second kind of marriage heals the first kind of wound. That a woman who has been bought and then chosen, and chosen slowly and gently and without pressure, and chosen by a man who understood the difference and who would have driven her to Rock Springs and paid her passage anywhere in the world if she had asked him to, can in time find that the buying is no longer the story. The choosing is the story. The choosing is always the story. We lived on Silver Ridge 41 years together. Eben died in the winter of 1929, in the big bed in the room he had added onto the cabin the spring before our wedding. With his hand in mine and Mattie June at the foot of the bed. Mattie June, who was 50 years old by then, and a grandmother twice over, and he went gentle, the way he had lived, and I buried him on the south slope beside Clara, because he had asked me to, and because I had loved Clara too by then, loved her through her letters that he had kept in the trunk, and through the stories Mattie June had grown up on, and through the simple fact that she had made him into the man who had walked across the sawdust toward me, with his hat in his hands. I am an old woman now, telling you this story. I am telling it because there is a kind of tenderness in the world that is quiet, and that does not announce itself, and that a young woman in a hard place can miss if she is not listening for it. I am telling it because I was 19 years old in the loft above my uncle's cabin on the morning of December the 14th, and I thought my life was over, and it was only beginning. I am telling it because if you are listening to my voice tonight, and there is some cold loft above your own life, some hard uncle or hard debt or hard winter, I would like you to hear from one who has been there that a kind man may yet walk into the back of the barn, that the hammer may yet fall for you, that the wagon ride up the ridge in the falling snow may yet be ahead of you. Listen for the quiet ones. The loud men will tell you they are the story. They are not. The quiet ones are. Thank you for sitting with me through this long telling. May your own ridge be kind to you. May the door you walk through be one you chose. May the hand that holds yours have waited patiently for the holding. Good night from Silver Ridge. Good night from Tilly Kincaid-Strickland, who was once Matilda Renfrew, and who stood on a crate in a livery-barn, and who walked off it into a life she had not dared to imagine. Good night.